Over the last 2 decades, China has provided a record amount of international development finance, and established itself as a financier of first resort for many low and middle-income countries. However, its grant-giving policies and lending activities remain shrouded in secrecy. According to the comprehensive report issued by Aid Data, a U.S.-based global research institute, there are 13,427 projects worth $843 billion across 165 countries in every region in the world in the past 2 decades. Extraordinary expansion in China's overseas development finance program was recorded during the implementation of China's Belt and Road Initiative. With 140 participating countries, nearly 1,000 projects are underway, and hundreds of billions of dollars committed. The ambition of Beijing's flagship infrastructure program is extraordinary and without precedent. China's leader, Xi Jinping, has described the BRI as the project of the century and a road for peace, prosperity, opening up, and innovation, connecting different civilizations that will build a broad community of shared interests. With annual international development finance commitments hovering around $85 billion a year, China outspends the US and other major powers on a 2-to-1 basis. As China increases lending to other developing countries, charges that these loans lead to a fear of a debt trap, and these are growing quickly. Accordingly, China lends to extract economic or political concessions when a debtor country is unable to meet payment obligations. Thus, it overwhelms poor countries with loans to eventually make them subservient. Though apparently, these debts, for the most part, do not appear on government balance sheets, but are rather directed to state-owned companies, state-owned banks, special-purpose vehicles, joint ventures, and private sector institutions. Here in Southeast Asia, according to the US-based global research institute Aid Data, several countries are in distress to be fallen into China's debt trap through major infrastructure projects. From smaller nations of Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar to major Asean economies of Vietnam, Malaysia, and even the biggest economies in the region, Indonesia. Thailand and the Philippines are the only emerging ASEAN countries that are less vulnerable to China's debt trap through infrastructure projects. Even though in Thailand, few projects are constructed through a partnership of Chinese firms, its financing wears shoulder by the Thai government. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, 3 major rail projects which Beijing is committed to finance are deemed cancelled. These are the Bicol to Calamba, Clark-Subic, and Mindanao railway projects. The Philippines' application for funding with Beijing were terminated after China wanted to charge an interest rate of 3%, compared to the more competitive offer of Japan at a 0.1% interest rate. Instead of going through the same foreign funding route, the Philippines has opted to seek only official development assistance programs and public-private partnerships for its projects. Indonesia received the highest recipient of the Chinese loan amounting to $34.4 billion, of which only $4.4 billion was considered as sovereign debt. While $30 billion as other official flows, on which the $17 billion was considered as hidden public debt, which has been incurred by state-owned companies or other government entities without sovereign guarantees. That means, 78% of Indonesia's debt to China is off the government's books, which is ominously described as a ticking time bomb that could impact the country's future economic development. However, based on data from Bank Indonesia, debt from Chinese creditors as of March this year stood at $22.01 billion United States dollars. Though the figures from Indonesia's central bank and Aid Data are different, but it is clear that Indonesia's financial obligations to China are increasing, and there are worries they will continue to expand. One of the biggest projects funded by China is the Jakarta to Bandung high-speed rail, which was originally expected to cost around $5.5 billion, but now the project's estimated cost reached to $7.9 billion. The Indonesian government will now shoulder the cost overrun of more than $2 billion, in contrast, that its government will never get involved in project financing. The project was funded through 75% loans from the China Development Bank, and the rest from KCIC coffers. KCIC, in turn, is 60% owned by the Indonesian government-owned corporation and 40% by the Chinese firm. The aid data report highlighted a list of 72 Indonesian BRI projects, amounting to a total of $21 billion. 9 of those, worth $5.2 billion, have been tainted by scandals, controversies, or alleged violations. 4 were linked directly to financial wrongdoing. Vietnam has famously eschewed China's Belt and Road Initiative. But according to Aid Data Report, the country has been the recipient of over $16.3 billion in Chinese project financing from 2000 to 2017, as other official flows amounting to $16.4 billion. With only $1.3 billion reported as sovereign debt. The report suggests that the country is increasing its debt burden to China, far beyond what is commonly thought. Creating political risk and impacting Vietnam's potential policies toward its neighbor to the north, which is already prone to bullying and intimidation. But Vietnam's concerns are clearly warranted. Hanoi has limited its sovereign debts to China. It has encouraged non-sovereign engagements, through commercial banks, state-owned enterprises, and even private companies, in order to reduce its political risk. One of the biggest projects funded by China was the Cat Linh Ha Dong Urban Railway, where the rail project was still not operational when the first installment payment became due. Debt owed by Vietnam to China for constructing a rail line in the capital Hanoi was started in October 2011 and is projected to begin running in 2015. But after 10 years of construction, the project, which covers a 13.5-kilometer line, and 12 elevated stations is not ready to serve passengers until December 2021, and investment costs have soared to $868 million from the initial $553 million. China has also been accused of seeking influence over the Straits of Malacca, through which some 80% of its oil imports pass. Debt trap proponents claim Beijing inflated lending for Malaysia's controversial East Coast Rail link. ECRL was initiated by former Malaysian Prime Minister Datuk Seri Najib Razak. Ostensibly to develop the less developed east coast of peninsular Malaysia as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, it rejected other less costly but much needed options. However, the project undergoes a total modification of the contract, which is currently considered a more favorable and cheaper project cost to Malaysia. Another project constructed by China was the Forest City in Iskandar, Malaysia. This project, valued at about $100 billion, is the most capital-intensive among Chinese projects in the country. Forest City is also projected to house 700,000 people, taking advantage of the site's proximity to the Malaysia-Singapore second link. Country Garden has aggressively marketed Forest City as a prime model of a future city while offering prospective residents an exclusive island living paradise. The firm's goal is to project the image of Iskandar, Malaysia as the next Shenzhen, with neighboring Singapore portrayed as an analog to Hong Kong during Shenzhen's initial boom years in the 1980s and 1990s. However, the project became a center of controversies and political propaganda, causing too much reputational damage, and aggravated by the pandemic, the conceived futuristic city is currently on backlushed. With fewer commercial activities, considering that only 10,953 homeowners, and only one of the 4 islands have been completed, Forest City was tainted as a ghost city. As reported, Malaysia is a recipient of China's financing, a total of $22 billion. On which, $12 billion is in the form of official developmental assistance and the rest is considered as hidden debts. Laos faces bankruptcy, but unlike another crisis-ridden Asian state of Sri Lanka, its future is not in its own hands. That role is played by China, whose aggressive lending has helped to take one country to the brink of default, and the other well past it. Laos' macroeconomic situation is very challenging, ranging from rampant inflation to external debt overload, much of which is owed to its neighbor and creditor-in-chief, China, exacerbated by the impacts of the pandemic, a deteriorating global macroeconomic environment, and the rapid depreciation of the Lao kip. The biggest Lao project financed by China is the Lao-China Railway. The total cost of the project is $5.9 billion, equivalent to roughly one-third of Laos' GDP. And it is being financed by a 60-40 debt-to-equity ratio. LCRC directly secured $3.5 billion of debt financing from China Exim Bank, and the government of Laos and the Chinese government contributed $730 million and $1.6 billion of equity financing, respectively. In order to make its $730 million equity contribution to the project, the government of Laos secured a $480 million loan from China Exim Bank, and it agreed to provide $250 million of its own funding in annual installments. The financing of the project is a classic case of double gearing or pyramiding, which raises an important question about the financial health of the project company. An equity stake should be an asset, but if it is financed with debt, it is a liability, which suggests that the asset may be worthless. In other words, the project company structure that underpins the China-Laos Railway project is seemingly being used to obscure more debt accumulation, rather than for limited liability protection. China is also getting involved in several projects in Cambodia. As of June 2021, China had built 8 bridges and 3,287 kilometers of roads via more than $3 billion in Chinese concessional loans, according to a Future Forum report. According to aid data, Cambodia is a recipient of almost $10 billion of China's financing, which is only $2.2 billion as sovereign debts. Likewise, Myanmar's debt to China is reaching $9.4 billion, where $2.7 billion is through official development assistance, and $6.6 billion through private and government corporations. But for many, the real issue is not about the infrastructure project conceived by many as a debt trap, it's about the recipient government's efforts to harness Chinese investment and development financing to advance domestic political agendas, reflecting both need and greed. The recipient countries are not hapless victims, but actively shape how China's development financing system is being implemented.